Fletcher's Solicitors are proud to sponsor the Mama Academy podcast series. We are one of the UK's leading birth injury specialists, trusted by families with the most complex legal cases. We champion better maternity care through every family's story. Fletcher's Solicitors, for every birth, for every baby, for every family. For more information about how we can help, visit www.fletchersolicitors.co.uk.
Hello and welcome back to the Mama Podcast. This episode continues our series exploring the people, conversations, and experiences shaping maternity and neonatal care. Today, we focus on Placenta Accreta Spectrum, PAS, the importance of early diagnosis, and the role of specialist support throughout pregnancy. We're joined by Nik and Amisha Adhia, founders of Action For Accreta, alongside Miss Chineze Otigbah, consultant in fetal medicine. Together, they share the powerful story behind the campaign, discussing the realities of living with PAS, the challenges of navigating a complex diagnosis, and why greater awareness, advocacy, and education are essential for improving outcomes for mothers and families.
Well, welcome to this edition of the Mama Podcast. I'm Heidi Eldridge, the founder and CEO of Mama Academy, and I am here now with Nik Amisha and Dr. Otigbah. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to learn all about Amisha and Nik's fabulous campaign, which is Action For Accreta. So I'm going to come to you first, Amisha, if that's all right. Can you introduce yourself to us and tell us where your pregnancy journey began and when you realised that something wasn't quite right?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, and thanks for having us on this podcast today. So I'm Amisha Adhia, and my husband and I have started off a campaign called Action For Accreta. And essentially, it's been born from a condition that I had during pregnancy, which Miss Otigbah kindly found out for us. And it's essentially called Placenta Accreta, where your placenta becomes sort of stuck or starts growing through the uterine lining. But I'll leave the medical terms for Miss Otigbah a little bit later. This was actually our second pregnancy. So we had our first son born in 2023. And then this was actually our second pregnancy through IVF. We were always deemed to be a high-risk profile due to my medical or my complex medical profile and due to it being IVF conception. But they were all still sort of routine things that any medical professional would see for any patient coming in. So there was nothing startling or alarming at that point. But because it was deemed to be a high-risk pregnancy, we decided to just have to be seen privately for extra scanning on the side, just to make sure everything was ticking along nicely and there was nothing for us to worry about. So that's when we were seeing Miss Otigbah for these private scans. It was when we came to our U12 scan, it's when we just went in, it was a normal day, and Miss Otigbah spotted abnormal blood flow in places they probably shouldn't have been. And this is probably when she turned around to us and she said, "What do you know about Placenta Accreta?" We'd never heard of it, so we didn't think much of it. We just thought, oh, placenta, it's just something small. We didn't think much of it at all, actually. So we went away, we did our research, and then we realized what this actually meant and how catastrophic it could potentially be if it wasn't managed well. So we returned again for I believe it was our 16-week scan. Yeah. And that's when Miss Otigbah essentially noticed things like placental lunaci, and also bridging vessels, amongst a few other bits and pieces. Again, we'd heard about it, we'd done the research, so we knew that this wasn't sounding very good. But essentially, they were all leading to signs of Placenta Accreta. At that point, I think when Miss Otigbah almost sort of was quite confident that this is what I had, I turned around to Nik and she did this, and he just went white as a sheet. And I just saw him almost pass out. And Nik is quite a strong guy, as Miss knows. And honestly, I just felt the blood drain out of my body. And I think that's exactly what Nik probably felt at the same time. Because we just knew what it could mean, what the outcome of this could potentially be. And it was very scary. So we then thought, okay, well, we've never heard of this condition. Let's probably go and get a second opinion on this and speak to a few more people to find out, what's going on. Is it really there? What is it? We never doubted Miss Otigbah for one second, but as a patient, you always feel like, oh, let me just get a second opinion. So this is when we contacted two specialists, and we went to see them, and they scanned me. We talked about it, and they advised us that you don't have placenta accreta. It's probably low probability. You don't need to worry about it. So we thought, okay, this doesn't sound about right. Like, how is one person so sure and the other person isn't? So we went back to our incumbent hospital to be seen by the fetal medicine specialist there. And they also confirmed that I didn't have it. So things were starting to look a little bit imbalanced and we were a little bit confused. So we then decided to join the patient community on Facebook groups. And we spoke to other people who may or may not have had this diagnosis. And that's where we discovered that there are actually specialist centers. So placenta is also known as PAS, which is Placenta Accreta Spectrum. And that's when we discovered there are actually specialist centers that we could go to and be seen to. So we did do that. We actually went to these specialist centers. 3 of them said to us that you don't have it. There's a low probability of it. So there's no real route forward there. One of them said that they saw some signs in line of placenta accreta, and then said, okay, we can put you on the potentially PAS pathway. But very soon after, they just changed their decision. They just said, we're not doing it anymore. You don't have placenta accreta. It's fine. So we were left in a position where I think it was at this point, we got to week 28 of our pregnancy. And essentially the system broke for us. We're at the highest point of risk in our pregnancy because obviously had developed over all this time. We'd been these specialists and second opinions. And we had no delivery hospital. And I remember it was at that point, my husband, Nik, and I both came home. We sat down and we just broke down because we'd been seeing Miss Otigbah the whole way through this. And she'd been telling us that it's there. And as the time was progressing, it was becoming more apparent. And during this time, you're also doing all your research. So when you get to a point where you're just so tired of challenging people and back saying, please check more, please check in this area, please check this, please check that, you get to a point where you're like, what am I going to do? We both just broke down, and I think my husband just said to me, I don't want you to die. And I think we both just sat there, and Nik, I think we both just sat there, we just both broke down, we were holding each other's hands, sitting on our bed, and we just cried for like half an hour. So it was a horrible feeling. And that's when, shortly after, we went back to Miss Otigbah and we were like, we believe you, we want to be with you and help us, essentially. And that's when we went down Miss Otigbah's pathway, and she swept us up, took her into her sort of arms, and I think we just felt a glimmer of hope at that point. And I think Nik and I just had a sort of like an ounce of hope just came back into our lives, and we thought, okay, our son's not going to be left without a mum. Our daughter will survive this, and we will still remain as a family unit. So that's when our journey then started in Miss Otigbah. And then we were allocated, or we were given, quite nicely to say, Louise, who is our sort of angel in disguise, who was our 24/7 midwife, who gave us specialist care. We were booked in for all our scans with her. We then, Miss Otigbah, you then advised us that we were given a delivery date, and I think we were put in for 36 weeks, which is within the PAS framework to say the full safe delivery. And we went through the journey with you, and the delivery was interesting, and Ishani was born. She unfortunately stopped breathing at birth. And then we went down the NICU route. She's absolutely fine now, but it was very traumatic what happened with her because it was unexpected. And there were a few other complications that came about towards the end of my pregnancy. So it was a journey for everyone involved. I think even for Nik, it was quite tough, and I'm understating it. But we held on, and Miss Otigbah was our guiding angel throughout it all.
Gosh, I can't imagine what that must have felt like and what you must have gone through. 9 months of pregnancy feels like eternity anyway, and then you're having to deal with all that as well. So what did it really feel like to have your concerns dismissed by multiple hospitals before you finally got that correct diagnosis?
It felt like we were banging against stone walls, to be honest, because we had Miss Otigbah on one side who was so confident in her diagnosis, and I'm so glad that she remained adamant that it was there, because she was the only person who kept trying to knock some sense into us to say, you've definitely got it. But when you keep getting doubted by other people who are supposedly in specialist centers saying to you, you don't have it, it knocks your confidence a little bit to be like, oh, do I actually have it? It brings some doubt in. But when we were going to these appointments, we kept saying, we've seen it on Miss Otigbah's scans. Miss Otigbah showed us when we were there with her to say, this is a bridging vessel, this is a high. This is where your placenta has attached to. Look at all this blood flow between the segments of your uterus. When we were going to these specialist centers, we were saying to them, look, I can see it. How can you not see it? Like, it's there. And they were saying, no, that's not really right. What you're looking at is not correct. It just felt like we were just not being listened to. We were unheard, almost dismissed, I would say. You just feel like you just want them to listen. You just want them to stop what they're doing and just listen for 1 second. The sad thing about the whole thing is that we just felt, and now that we know, we just feel that we were constantly reassured into danger. And, nobody should feel like that.
No, you don't know who to trust, do you? So thank goodness for Miss Otigbah picking it all up. So you mentioned about the midwife that you then had looking after you at Barking, covering a Redbridge. What does good care really look like? What made a difference for you at that point?
She was very well informed about A, the condition, B, our journey so far, and C, about what needs to happen for us to be able to go through the pathway efficiently, when we need our scans, what we need to do to manage the condition outside of a clinical environment. And she just had empathy, which a lot of medical staff don't have. She really listened to us, and she became more of a friend throughout the whole journey. No concern was ever too small or too big. Whatever we said to her, we were feeding at the time. She just empathized, and I think that doesn't happen in normal clinical settings. I remember the first time I met her, and I think that you could probably say this. When you go into a medical setting, everyone's very poised, very professional. What's your name? Where you from? Almost like a sort of black date. It's just kind of like okay, fine, whatever. It's just going to be the standard protocol. But she walked in. She's like, "You must be Amisha," and she just stood there with her arms wide open. She's like, "Can I give you a hug?" So it was like the nicest feeling, because you feel like, oh my gosh, I walked into. It feels like this feels familiar. This feels like a friend has just opened her arms up and said, "I will look after you." And I know that's not normal for most settings, but the way that Ms. Otigbah has set up her team, and this wasn't just Louise, the whole team were like that when we were there. Every single person, whether you were somebody who was looking after the anaesthetist side of it, there were lots of different parts of it, and it's all a blur to me now. But the whole team, every single person, was just friendly, very empathetic, and they listened. So I had multiple concerns about delivery because I've been through a C-section before, and I was really worried about the spinal injection and the clinical environment, because I just thought I don't want to feel like I'm panicking again when I get there. But they all were prepped in advance. They knew what my concerns were, And when I got into that environment, they all put me at ease. And I think, you know, from the very first person we met, Louise, to the very last person we saw towards our end of our delivery, every single person was just so capable of what they were doing.
Wow, that is so lovely to hear. And how powerful was that, and the difference that made to you by the team knowing you guys, they knew your story, they knew what you were going through, and you had that sort of continuity where you didn't have to keep explaining your story to everybody. Everyone knew what was going on. And that's amazing. It makes such a difference. And what do you think you wish you'd known, especially during your antenatal appointments? What would you say that was?
I think part of it is that we don't champion ourselves enough. We don't advocate for ourselves enough. We listen to the first opinion given to us at all our appointments. So I would say that it's okay to ask for a second opinion, which a lot of people, we didn't really even know that we could do that. It's okay to ask to recheck something or to be seen by somebody else, or for 2 or 3 doctors, even within the same environment, to have a look, because everyone carries different expertise and experience. In this setting, I would just say there's just check the placenta. Like, everybody's looking at the baby, but not everybody's looking at the placenta in enough depth. I also think that if there was a little bit more training available to doctors, even just on a basic level, then even if somebody doesn't provide a diagnosis early on, they would know to look out for certain signs, to be like, this looks a little bit not quite right, or not quite something I'm aware of. Let me just refer it on to a more senior clinician who can come and have a look at the scans or come into the appointment. So I would say self-advocacy, challenge the status quo. Don't just go with the first opinion given to you. And be confident in yourself that you can ask for another opinion.
Definitely. And do you have any advice for families that might be feeling a little bit apprehensive about speaking up and challenging and advocating for themselves?
I would say that I think don't doubt yourselves. I think that's probably the bottom line of this. Don't doubt yourselves. If you have a concern, raise it. If you're not sure about something, raise it. If you even have an inkling of sort of, I'm not sure about this, definitely raise it. Go and have a look at other obstetricians that may be available in a specialist area if you're worried about something. If, I think the main thing is just don't take the first opinion. If your gut is telling you this isn't right, listen to your instinct, because your instinct is usually always right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Amisha, for taking us through that whole journey. So, Miss Otigbah, like, my gosh, you've got a fantastic service there and a fantastic team behind you. Can you explain more about Placenta Accreta to us? Why are sort of atypical past presentation, missed sometimes in routine care?
So Amisha has actually described PASS very nicely. It is a situation where your placenta just doesn't come away after the baby's born. I know there are circumstances called retained placenta. This is not necessarily retained placenta, although the two can be together. But basically, the placenta adheres or attaches abnormally. And so whereas if you have a baby, you wait 30 minutes and the placenta usually comes away quite smoothly, this placenta does not move because it's either on the surface, attached to the surface of the womb, or enters into the muscles of the womb, and rarely beyond the womb. Sometimes you can find the placenta has gone all the way through into the bladder or the surrounding organs. So it is quite a significant problem, because any attempt to remove that placenta will result in catastrophic bleeding. And you have to make it very clear, it is called catastrophic bleeding because you can bleed 5 liters within 5 minutes. It's quite significant. And that's why it is important that when it's identified, it's managed by people who know what to do to prevent that catastrophic bleeding. and have all the equipment and all the personnel around them to support them to keep that woman safe. So that's basic PAS, which is at the lower part of the uterus where we expect to find it, because we know most women who've had a cesarean section have a weakness where this abnormal attachment will occur, and that's where people will look for it. Okay, but now comes in the next group of patients where they may have had a cesarean section, but they may have had other things done to their uterus as well, IVF, advanced maternal age, scenarios where you take the fibroids out, scenarios where you've had to have multiple, D's and C's because of miscarriages. Anything where there's trauma to the uterus away from the scalp can cause the same situation we found down below. But people don't look up there. Now, it's funny how the stars seem to align. About 2 or 3 months before Amisha and Adhia, well, around the time where they were pregnant, whilst working at Queen's Hospital, I was hauled up to the trust governance group because we were having a spate of hysterectomies. And we couldn't understand why, out of the blue, these women were losing their wombs, just 2 or 3 of them. And we wondered why. And interestingly, a lot of them had undiagnosed PAS. And it was undiagnosed because it was in the wrong place. And I thought, well, this is not good. So maybe this is a time for us to start looking elsewhere. And of course, when Amisha came along, the placenta was a bit lower. I thought, I'll just give it a look, just have a little look. And lo and behold, and I don't want to say this, but it did light up like a Christmas tree. And I thought, this is not the time to tell this couple, having gone through the journey of IVF, that you think there's something wrong. And I didn't want to say anything without being almost 99% certain, because I can imagine what kind of reaction you have with that kind of diagnosis. And unfortunately, if you give that diagnosis, and some women, they may just say, you know what, I'm not having this baby. And that would be a tragedy for me as well. So I said, no, until I'm certain, I will wait. And indeed, when I saw her again at about 16 weeks, as you said, all the features I would normally find in a lower PAS were higher up. But because none of my colleagues were thinking that way, and my colleagues are really good at picking up PAS, make no mistake, 90% of them will be picked up, there was this problem. And the other issue with atypical PAS, unfortunately, it does not have the same features. Many of those features have not been diagnosed yet or used clinically. So that's where the problem lies. So what I decided was, well, you know what? Even if I'm wrong, it's fine. But I'm going to make sure that I have everything in place just in case I'm right. And I was right. And when I saw it, my instinct was, oh my goodness, I need to take a picture of this, because I was so tired of being told I was wrong by all my colleagues. So you can imagine how lonely that must be. There's a huge responsibility. And of course, again, it's another time that Nik almost fell onto the floor when he saw the photo. Yeah, I mean, I didn't feel pleased I was vindicated. I was just so relieved that, they had come back to me and we'd done the things that we had to do. So that's what happened.
What were those things? So how do you treat for it? What precautions do you take once you've found that there's a problem?
So we have a protocol that we use at Queen's, and it's been born out of other cases that we've tried to sort of think. She's, first of all, we have trained our sonographers to identify the risk factors, the ones that I have already explained to you, which is not the same thing that's done in other units. So my sonographers now will take extra care when they're looking at a woman who's had fibroids removed, who's had their uterus, when some people have a heart-shaped uterus and they miscarry, where they've had that septum removed, or if the surfaces of the uterus are stuck together, if they've had that sort of surgery. Any surgery to the uterus that's significant, they will take a very careful look at and then refer to the fetal medicine specialist, which is myself and 2 other consultants. And they also use the criteria they would use normally for lower PAS when they're looking at placenta. So they pretty much map the placenta. So even if there's no history, or they're thinking, well, this looks a bit funny, this looks a bit bright, or there's a lot of shadows that I'm not happy with, and refer. So it's risk factors, And what you see at the 20, and it's usually the 20-week scan, because the 12-week scan is for Down syndrome and everything else, but it's the 20-week scan when you're trying to find, where does this placenta sit? Is it high? Is it low? And that's what we do routinely at the 20-week scan. But we go one step further and say, oh, I can see a few black spaces, the lacunae, or goodness me, that area looks quite thin. And they put the Doppler color on it, and then they can see, oh my goodness, there's a lot of blood flow here. Let's refer on to the fetal medicine unit. And that's how we've been able to look for them now.
Wow, okay, so that's the sort of red flags that sonographers should be looking out for at the
But
scan.
it's mainly the risk factors, Heidi, because obviously, you can't do it in everybody. Well, you can, but it'll take a lot of time. But clearly, if a woman's had fibroids taken out and she's had IVF to get pregnant and she's 40, my goodness, she's got 3 very high risk factors. So those are the ones we would definitely want to see.
Absolutely, I see. And how's the rise in C-section rates had an impact on placental complications?
Well, it certainly has increased the lower type of PASs that we have. Absolutely has done. And I think I would say it's 4 or 5-fold. I mean, when we started looking at PAS, and I would say my first well-diagnosed PAS case was in 2004. And in those days, we had 2 a year. And now I'm probably up to my 16th, and it's June. So it's more than doubled, more than quadrupled. Now, if half your population, half the women are having deliveries by cesarean section, it makes perfect sense that this is going to increase as well. And that's what's happening. And I think that's the other reason why lots of women are having a lot of blood loss, because if you're going to have a surgical delivery, you inevitably will bleed more than if you have a normal vaginal delivery. I'm not saying normal vaginal is the best, but I'm saying that you're more likely to have more bleeding, obviously infection, etc., if you have a cesarean section. And so the recovery, what happens afterwards, are all things that may contribute to not just lower PAS, but upper PAS as well.
I see. And what's the difference between, textbook presentation and what you're actually seeing clinically?
Huge. In fact, in order to pick up one positive diagnosis, and this is just a little tiny look at, you probably have to scan about 3 or 4 times the number of women. It's not like routine PAS where you put the Doppler on and say, this is it, 90% of chances you're okay. With atypical, it's not that easy. And I think it's not easy because nobody's doing it. I think as time goes by, it becomes more refined and then it will be a lot easier to do. But for me, it's not the diagnosis. It's how do you prevent the blood loss? Because if I sat Amisha down and said, you have a condition where you might lose 7 liters of blood, that to her is probably more scary than saying, well, your placenta might get a little bit stuck. So I think it's all about, you have got a placenta that does look like it may cause extra bleeding. We're going to do everything we can to prevent that. And women are not so scared, and therefore it's not so awful. Whereas when you just mentioned Accreta, they only have to go online and they know that you've got a 7%, where they used to say you've got a 7% chance of dying, you've got X number of chances of going to intensive care, you may end up with a hysterectomy, etc., etc. So those are the things that women will see and they will be petrified. And so we need to find a way of warning them about this condition, and that means informing them so that they know to ask the right questions, because a woman with knowledge is many, many times more powerful than a woman who has no knowledge at all. And making sure, as Amisha said, that you are determined. You say, I hear what you're saying, but I need someone to have a look at this properly. And of course, the clinicians to act in such a way that they don't forget that these women are still pregnant. And so one of the things that Louise, our midwife, does really well, she maintains the normality of being pregnant, because for many women, this is a surgical problem. According to the past surgeons, this is a surgical problem. She either needs a hysterectomy, she needs a balloon, she's going to have XY amount of blood. They treat it like anything, like a massive surgery. Whereas, no, this is a woman having a baby. And the fact you have a midwife who's her advocate, who speaks to her, who gets up at 3 o'clock in the morning if she has something she's not happy with, makes it much more real, makes it more like she's pregnant and not a woman with a surgical problem. And that is the beauty of the PAS midwife. And unfortunately, not many centers have used their have PAS midwives that work that way. Yeah. So she has almost like she has her own cohort of patients that she looks after, the so-called continuity of care, which is really important for all women having babies.
That is so interesting. And you mentioned earlier about the retention of a placenta.
Yeah.
What research is needed into that?
Well, you see, the thing about retained placentas is that the majority of them happen either because the uterus didn't contract down enough, or the cervix, the neck of the womb, closed before the placenta came away. And usually it's more of the placenta just didn't come out. Not that the placenta got stuck, but within that cohort of women where the placenta got stuck at the neck of the womb or was flopping around in the uterus. And you know them, you go to theatre and they just literally drop in the ball and think, oh, that wasn't too bad then. The difference between those and PAS is that they never come out. And if you try and pull them out, they come out piecemeal. And inevitably, if they come out that way and you take a biopsy or you have to take the womb out because she just bleeds, then you'll find out, by which time obviously it's too late. So many women will have retained placentas for the reasons I described, but fewer will have it because of PAS.
I see. Well, that's been so insightful, I have to say. Thank you so much. So I'm going to come to you now, Nik, from the father's perspective. Your campaign is just absolutely fantastic. It has been everywhere, and we're absolutely delighted to support you with that. But tell us, how did you go from a near fatal experience to launching this national campaign?
So first and foremost, before I go on, I think the work that you do, Heidi, and you are a one-woman army in many respects, but Mama Academy has been a force and a platform for change for many women and families. And I think it was even in our first ever pregnancy, we saw that little packet in our hospital with Mama Academy's proud logo. And we just knew that that was going to be a resource for us to be able to educate ourselves. And honestly, throughout our pregnancy, we came back and we saw articles and we listened to things like this. And it was actually this that gave us confidence that we were being heard in places outside of our hospital. So I wanted to set the scene for that, because that actually is what happened next. So aside from nearly falling on the floor and with my size causing a possible earthquake in the theatre in Queens, we wanted to create a change because, being honest, I think there was a polarizing moment for me inside the theatre, and it was seeing the vindication of obviously this being PAS, and obviously from that perspective, seeing my wife being the most fearful I've ever seen her, feeling that she might die, and also going through those motions of knowing that my wife could die, despite the fact that we trusted Miss Otigbah, we had Louise there. There was the other moment where my daughters cried for a little bit, and then it stopped and it became more and more silent. And she had breathing difficulties, and there was a moment where we moved around, and I think the world just stopped, because I had a moment where I was like, well, what happens if I lose my wife, and what happens if I also lose my child? And there was more and more people clamoring around my child, and Amisha kept asking, well, what's going on with Ishani? Is she okay? And I could tell something was wrong, and I obviously went over, and she'd gone purple and she was blue and she was not doing well. And obviously she went into ventilation. And I remember there was this really weird moment from a father's perspective. We left I left the surgical theatre because I was told by the doctor, you have to come now. You have to make a decision whether you stay with your wife or you come with us. And Amisha had made me promise, you need to go with our daughter with whatever happens. And I knew that Mr. Otigbah was beavering away because there was lots of, obviously there was more blood from some of the adhesions. And then I got to this point where she'd gone into an incubator, and I just broke down, and I realized that I got a hug from this lady in the ward. It was actually lovely. Actually, it was very unexpected, and she said, "Look, it's going to be okay." And this was actually a psychotherapist, which I didn't realize that wards had these. And for fathers, it's really quite daunting, or any birthing partner, because you're actually forced into that setting, not realizing that that was a risk. The whole time we'd thought Amisha was the one at risk. We'd never really looked at the Ishani and thought. And to be fair to Miss Otigbah, she'd noticed that Amisha had additional fluid in her amniotic sac. There was an idea there was polyhydramnios. The GTT test, which for reference for those listening is basically how you spot gestational diabetes. 3 of those were completely wrong. But Mr. Otigbah was like, there's something not quite right. And we were also making sure that the delivery was within 36.5 within the sort of ARCOG guidelines. But because of that delivery being early, I'm pretty sure that's the reason my daughter's still here, because she was too big for her lungs, and that meant that she was obviously on breathing difficulties. So then you ask the question, well, what? That's just a traumatic experience that unfortunately many people do go through in the system today. How do you translate that trauma and pain into something that we're now seeing, and how do you reach out to people? And the first thing for us was that we'd worked with Wes Streeting previously in a previous capacity with my aunt that had some challenges. And this was really, and I'm being very honest here, she actually had real challenges within the hospital that Chineze was in, and that was the reason we didn't actually come to Chineze in the first place, because we'd had a really bad experience that got to the ombudsman, CQC had gone really quite far. And I said, I'll be damned if I go back to this hospital of all places. And we only went really back because of Chineze. So it was a really big decision to go back to a hospital that we had real problems with in other parts of our care. And we'd had to work with Wes, and fortunately that work actually changed the law for DNA CPRs just last year. But we wrote this. I started writing that day when she held my hand. It was the most beautiful thing. She held my hand, and I made her a promise and said, I'm not going to let another mother and daughter or son or family go through this. And I just started writing. That turned out to be a 184-page document, just because all of you know my emails are really succinct and to the point. And it became a Bible of sorts. Within 2 weeks, we hand delivered that after our daughter came out of neonatal care to what was then the Secretary of State and our MP. And they were flabbergasted, because it was the most creative doorstop I think they've got in their history of constituency papers. And then we realized that we started talking to lots of women. It sounds really weird. As a father talking to lots of mums, I had to really educate myself, and so did Amisha, on like the anatomy of people, and just, you're talking to trauma-informed survivors, and you're really trying to get to the depths of what happened, because we weren't thinking about campaigning at that point. We were just like, we want to know why this is happening. And then suddenly something started coming up. We spoke to women in the US, we spoke to women in Australia, we spoke to women in the UK, in Canada, and suddenly something started appearing, and we didn't expect it. We thought it was all atypical presentations. It was places where you just wouldn't have seen in the uterus. And I thought, maybe it's a freak accident. Maybe it's just a small amount of people. And then you started hearing from women who suddenly had it in the lower part of their uterus, completely undiagnosed, women who had experienced some level of trauma, but also women that had reconstructive surgery. Their babies had cerebral palsy. We had partners we'd spoken to, because let's say we'd message someone on their Facebook profile, and you'd get a response back from the husband saying, I'm really sorry, but I can't talk about this because my wife passed away. And we were like, oh my gosh. And we unearthed something we weren't expecting. And that's when we came to you. Actually, funny enough, we were like, Heidi, we need help. We don't understand this, but we know that you've gone through this with other mums, other partners, and we started speaking to the charity sector and started thinking that, we can't do this alone. We need to go and speak to people that have good experience. They've been educating the community, and we realized we needed a village. On the back of that, we realized, well, okay, we've got the village now, and I think we're very fortunate that very quickly we secured the support of 12 charities and partners, and Mama Academy. And I'm proud to say this was one of the first people that Heidi picked up the phone and said, I want to hear you. And do you know what? That was the first time we felt really heard. And as a father, feeling heard in the community, being a father and also trying to advocate is very difficult in a community for women's health. And by December, we then realized that, we were going to take this more forward. So we engaged parliamentarians for the first time. And we actually, our good friend Wes was being a little bit more difficult for us to engage because of the ministerial code. So we thought we'd go around him and figure out, let's talk to everyone that's not him until he can't not talk to us. And then we ended up meeting fantastic people in the community. We met people like James Titcombe, Sir Jeremy Hunt. Lord Hunt has been absolutely fantastic. 30 plus parliamentarians, and we actually built it with consensus, knowing that we were essentially going to be talking to people across parties. So we spoke to Helen Morgan from the Liberal Democrats, Dr. Caroline Johnson from the Conservatives, different people like Michelle Welsh and others from the Labour Party, and we realised that. And then something weird happened that day. Something happened where we got a weird phone call in December, and this is at the time we were thinking about enlisting a PR agency. And someone said, you know, what happened to your wife? It's because, you know, the guidelines weren't correct. And I'm like, yeah, I know that. And like, you do know that these guidelines are about to change in March. And I was like, hold the phone. What? And this was the moment where everything converged. And we were like, wait, the guidelines that define how people look for placenta accreta. So we read them, and they're long. There's lots of information there, but yet it's the same thing. It's like, do you have PAS in the lower segment? Do you have previa? Do you have a previous C-section? But if it's 2 centimeters away, you go back to a standard pathway. And we were like, holy crap, this is exactly what had happened. The guidelines were designed in such a way for women in 2018, and they were perfectly designed for that environment. But a lot's happened since 2018. And we're now in a very different environment, as Mr. Otigbah said, like women having myomectomies, there are D&C procedures, there's lots of things going on. And then on the undertone of this, we've got lots of women suddenly coming into our inbox saying, well, we've just been completely missed. So we decided that, you know, it was now or never. And then the Baroness Amos investigation was also kind of the undertone of this. So we were like, it's now or never. We have to find a way to intervene. So that was when in January and February, we decided to bring everything together. We had the charities, we had obviously the different people that are coming together from the parliamentarians, we had the media, and then we landed essentially our intervention on the 18th of February. And it was interesting. I think it was definitely a response that was going to stay with me for the rest of my life in the clinical community.
Me
It's the best
too.
I can say. And there was a lot of defensiveness, being honest. I think
Yeah.
that there was a level of, this isn't PAS, you are wrong, this doesn't happen in your segment, from people that are very, very specialist in this area, and saying that you're not correct. And I remember, Heidi, we spoke about this, that you've been coaching us on this, that, you know, you're going to expect some backlash because you've gone about this in a specific way. And we were like, okay, fine. So then what ends up happening is that we start building this campaign, we start engaging the right stakeholders. And for us, it was always about the systemic issue. It was always about creating a mechanism that it was about the system. It wasn't about clinicians. It's about how do we create safer, equitable, and accessible care that diagnoses this earlier. But if we can't, how do you create a mechanism that every maternity unit has the preparedness to make sure that there isn't that postpartum hemorrhage, there isn't that situation of an emergency, because it cuts both ways. It's not just Amisha and I in that situation. It's the whole medical team. They're like, well, hold up, this placenta's not coming out. It's now an emergency. Someone's losing 5 liters of blood. That's trauma for that particular clinical team. So it cuts both ways. So fortunately, since then, we now have had 22 parliamentary questions that have been submitted, which has been a tidal wave, as we've been told. We've had ministerial meetings with Baroness Gillian Merrin, we've met with Wes Streeting, and we now have commitment, which I'm very pleased to share, from the team at the Royal College, including the president. I think, as people have seen, that atypical presentations and non-previa PAS will feature in the updated guidelines in summer 2026. So whilst it was planned to be released in March of 2026, we are pleased to see that the college is taking these concerns seriously. They are trying to find a constructive dialogue, but also these guidelines are going to define the next decade for women. And it will mean that, given that 73% of the women we spoke to never made it to a specialist center, and then 64% of them had emergency surgery. I mean, if you really think about it, if 2 out of 3 women are walking into a situation that they have no idea that their life is going to change, it's not going to be the birthing experience from the baby shower they expected, and they're going to have a catastrophic hemorrhage. I don't think you see that in oncology. You wouldn't see that. I mean, there would be uproar if you saw that someone found out they had cancer on the day that they were possibly going to die. That would not be something that people would take seriously. And this is why, we spoke about it yesterday, around maternity care has to be a public health priority. This is not something that can sit in the corner of women's health. It has to be something that we all take. And it requires a village. It requires wonderful people like you, Heidi, that do all the things you do with Mama Academy. It requires the clinical community, patients, parliamentarians, and it has to survive the political ecosystem. So yes, we are here where we are. it's been fast, exhausting, but we are trying to create change so that the next mother and the next baby and the next family have the protections they deserve.
Well, I just want to congratulate you guys on all of your work and the fact that you have achieved so much in such a short amount of time is just absolutely incredible. And I'm so proud of what you've done. And now you're having influence on the RCOG guidelines. You've been involved in the Baroness Amos Rapid Review. It's just absolutely incredible. So I hope you're taking some time to sort of reflect on what you've achieved, because I'm really guilty of doing that myself. I don't do it often. I'm always thinking, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? But yeah, you really deserve a huge pat on the back for everything you've done, because you are making such a massive difference. Yes. And I was going to ask you, Nik, actually, because you touched upon the other countries. You mentioned like America and Australia. What's our detection rate like in comparison to them?
So I'm glad you asked, because it's really interesting, because it was one of the things we started looking at around other ecosystems. Because women were coming from all different places, we started looking at, well, how do you detect if you've got Placenta Accreta Spectrum? And it is a spectrum. So there are FIGO grades, and it depends on the level of invasion, and it depends on the morbid adherence. Now, in a very simple way, if you've had a hysterectomy, which means you've lost your womb on your fertility, and I'm saying it in that way because it is a loss of your fertility, and it is significant as a life change if it wasn't something you expected. And or you've had a myometrial resection, which means that a part of it was essentially cut out. And that was essentially what Amisha had, where they were able to do a resection in that environment. Because you can see the connection between the uterine wall and the placenta, that can get sent over to something called histopathology. So it's basically like they send away the placenta whole into a lab setting, and the lab will then determine if there is essentially a sign of morbid adherence, and they have different grades in terms of them. The first grade is really what they call grade 1, which is accreta. So that is not necessarily superficial, but it is basically a way where it's attached at some level. Increta is where it goes through the uterine muscle. And then percreta, as Chineze and Miss Otigbah had been saying, is really when it starts to look at other organs, and it's going for blood flow, and it can be very, very dangerous. And Amisha had placenta increta, which was, it gone through the muscle, and it was almost on the borderline of percreta. And I think it was FIGO grade, what we call 3A. So the fact that it was missed is actually quite a concern from a medical perspective, because it was so advanced from that perspective. Now, when you look at the statistics in the UK, the UCOS guidelines at one point had been saying 1 in 2,500. That was the general UCOS guidelines. And then that got refined to 1 in 300 to 1 in 2,000. And that's the Royal College's guidelines. And you then think to yourself, that the facial expression you just gave gives it away. Like, how do you get from 1 in 300 to 1 in 2,000? That's the question we had, is like, how do you get such a wide ranging scale? And the reason for that is because the way that it's defined in the UK is based on a lab analysis confirmation that it is placenta accreta. Now, when you go to the US, it's very commonly known, and UCLA has published guidelines and their own research in the past, in January of 2026 as well, to confirm this. They had 14,000 pregnancies last year, of which 1 in 272 pregnancies, according to the RCOG equivalent in the US. And then if you look at certain research in Israel, you'll see 1 in 111. Now, then you start to think to yourself, well, it's not just because you jumped on to a plane to Tel Aviv or JFK, your uterus just suddenly changed and you're a different woman. Something is definitely is different. And look, the US has an insurance-based market, so there are coding standards and things that they have to do to basically, and that does mean that you have a high false positive rate. However, they look at clinical presentation, and most of the obstetricians and clinicians in the United States will say we would rather get 9 of these wrong and 1 of these correct to create that safe standard, as opposed to being in a situation where we are looking at a very narrow pathway. And there's always the argument of, are we overdiagnosing? Are we putting more women through hysterectomies? And those are very fair arguments. However, the point of it is that grade 1, which is that accreta scale, we're missing significant amounts of women, and as a result of that, because what happens is that they don't get picked up because either it's an atypical presentation or we don't have the diagnostic standards or the ultrasounds are not picking them up. And we're not sending things away to histopathology as a routine standard, because even if your placenta comes away in pieces, it's much more difficult to send that away for lab analysis. You then end up in a situation where you're only really catching grade 2 and 3, which are the most defined standards, and most of those defined standards are in the lower segment, just by the sheer fact that that's. So then what ends up happening is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start sending the referrals to the specialist centers. The only thing specialist centers really then see is serious cases, which they then report. Then you end up with undercounting, because all of the grade 1 and other ones that you're missing all go to places that are not the centers. So 73% of women turned up in district general hospitals and places that were completely unprepared. They didn't get them sent over to histopathology. But when they came to us, we saw examples of women that had retained placenta, and then they had pushed for a histopathology analysis, and then we found that there was placenta accreta, or they did find things in their notes that were markers of placenta accreta, or there were women that were just completely missed entirely, and they ended up with placenta accreta and hysterectomies because they were missed in the system itself. So in the US, they look for clinical presentation alongside lab analysis, where clinicians are looking at this and saying, well, you know what, actually, there's markers of placenta accreta. We should be looking at this as placenta accreta so that we're creating a safe care and pathway. The difference is if you start to only look at, if you keep calling something rare, people won't fund it. It's just the way that it works. It's like, it's a rare condition. Oh, it's once in a lifetime. But is it? Because we're doing analysis at the moment, we're seeing many, many, many women who are coming to us who have the presentation of placenta accreta or even retained placenta in certain circumstances. And Chineze makes a good point. Not every retained placenta is PAS, but some of them are. And some of them we're missing. And some of these cases are people that don't just retain placenta at the time of delivery. They come back in 4 weeks later because they've had a hemorrhage postpartum. They've had then sepsis. We've had several women that have been blue lighted back in 4 weeks later after delivery. So if you're sitting there listening to this thinking, you know what, my placenta got stuck and it was much more difficult than they expected, or it ended in an emergency that I wasn't expecting, or I had to go in because I had retained products. Generally, the guideline looks at this to say, if it was longer than 24 hours, and the FIGO guideline looks at this, if your placenta was there for longer than 24 hours, and research supports this, that 1 in 2 of those placentas may possibly actually be morbid adherence as opposed to atony or essentially the cervix closing. So and because of that, and because of the distinction between the two ecosystems, we're behind. Australia, the US, Canada, these countries are looking at women and saying, you know what, it's a birthing experience. We need to create a safe pathway. It can't just be an academic analysis, and we have to find a balance. It's not that we can screen every single person in the world, but we should be creating at least the same terminology and definition so that everyone's got a fighting chance. Because right now, as we've been talking in the space, I would say that at least one person has presented in an emergency somewhere in the UK with a bleeding emergency as a result. And they probably have no idea that in about a few days, they're going to have a word say that, oh, did you know you have placenta accreta? And that's just going to keep happening. And that's the reason we set the campaign up. And that's the reason we want to give the UK the opportunity to set the guidelines, to set the standards, and for the first time to review the different types of the uterine landscape, so that, you know what, we are leading the world in the way that we are looking at, obviously, Placenta Accreta Spectrum. But again, we are behind, we're undercounting. And the other component of this is that we're not also counting the deaths. So Embrace has no category, I think we spoke about this yesterday, for Placenta Accreta. Except we know from the confidential inquiries that many women have died with placenta accreta, but they've been masked under obstetric hemorrhage. And for other types of, the part that is something we're campaigning for is that amniotic fluid embolism, which is actually more rare than placenta accreta, sits as its own defined category within Embrace. So it goes back to the point that you can't, if you're not counting it, you can't actually measure it. And if you're not measuring it, you think it's rare. And if you think it's rare, you're not funding it. And then the person and the people that are harmed are women and their families and their birthing partners that have their lives completely changed. They walk away with dismembering disabilities, they have physical manifestations and reconstructive surgeries, they have trauma. Almost everyone has PTSD, and some of them have even had cerebral palsy because of a neonatal stroke, because of fetal demise. And there's significant amounts of women who've had their children have had neonatal stroke. So we think that this is one of those things that can be simply solved by changes in the guidelines, creating better training and diagnostics earlier in the process, and being able to create a national surveillance program so that you can't really solve a problem if you don't know it exists or you don't believe it exists.
It sounds very similar to fetal growth restriction, everything that you just said there about the national surveillance monitoring program, about classification. It's very, very similar. But you are really paving the way, Nik and Amisha. I can feel change is on its way. It's really, really exciting. The last thing I was going to ask you was just about, the families themselves. How can they sort of protect themselves, if you like, given the current gaps in care?
It's a good question. I think there's three really simple things you can do, because I think guidelines are going to change, but the infrastructure will be slower and it will take time. I think the first thing is I think what Amisha said, I think is the most important thing that's been said, is trust your instincts. I think women know their bodies. Like, you know when something's wrong. I think when Amisha and I were going to these centers, she kept saying, you know what, something's wrong, Nik. Like, I feel it. Like, there's something there that I don't feel right about. And we didn't know what it was. And Amisha was fully asymptomatic, so she wasn't bleeding, and it wasn't the normal Previa-based signs that you would see. So the first thing is trust your instincts. If you think something is wrong, it probably is, and you need to find someone that will listen. And that means that Martha's Rule now gives you the opportunity to seek a second opinion, but the concept of you can seek a second opinion, like you can self-refer. We have actually published, as a result of the work, the parliamentary work we've done, we have published the first ever list of PAS centres in the UK. So since 2020, there's been PAS centres that was through the hard work of many clinicians that brought that to the fore. We have now managed to unearth the actual list of centres. So there is a wider list of places where you can self-refer to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that what we can do for women is start to ask better questions around checking their placenta. And it goes back to what Chineze said at the very beginning, that at the very booking appointment, we should be asking more questions around women's uterine history. Like, did they have a previous C-section? Is there anything else that we should know? And having some basic training, and this is something that we're working with Miss Otigbah on, and we're trying to build a pilot program at this point, is at that 12-week scan and mostly at the 20-week scan, is there ways in which we can at least flag there's a possible risk? And that's the second part of this, which is trying to create almost the informal mechanisms of encouraging sonographers, if you're a clinician that's listening to this, to look for PAS across all of the uterus and look at the markers themselves. And I think the last thing, probably also the most important, is listen to women. Like, listen to what they're telling you, because if they're telling you that there's a suspicion, if there's an ounce of suspicion, it's not about the bottom line of what the CCG is funding or how much the surgery costs. And I'll tell you, the honest thing is, we looked at the NHS cost schedule. We looked at it. We did our maths on this. We looked at a cost of a C-section is around about £11,000 with proper planning. If you do it incorrectly and there's something goes wrong with undiagnosed women, it can go up to £105,000 in cost. So it's going to be far more costly for a centre when they need blood products, ICU admissions, and it's going to cost a lot more in the NHS budget. There needs to be minimum safety standards. So if you do see, if you're a patient and you know that there's a suspicion, there should be an opportunity to get you onto a care pathway that has the right people around you. So from a patient perspective, it's checking your placenta, advocating for yourself, getting a self-opinion. From a clinician's perspective, it's listen to your patients, think about your 20-week scan, think about your referral networks, and you know what, just the benefit of the doubt. These aren't women that are just coming to you because they've got a paper cut. These are the highest obstetric harm patients that you will see in the system. They deserve better, and they deserve your care, and they deserve the expertise that you already have. And you know what? We don't want to put any medical team into an emergency as much as we don't want to put the woman into an emergency. And this kind of helps both. I don't know if Chineze or Amisha have any other
No, you couldn't. I couldn't have said it better, actually. I think you've summarized it beautifully.
Very good.
Really
Very good.
have.
So what's next for the campaign? What's the next steps that you guys are going to be dealing
Amisha,
with?
do you want to cover the next steps?
I think you might be more eloquent at that. Do you want to?
So I can tell you three things that are going to happen very shortly. So we are planning a meeting with the Royal College. with Professor Wright and the team to find a constructive dialogue to ensure that the guidelines are reflecting lived experience, that they're reflecting atypical presentations, and that it's fit for purpose for and impartial and constructive for the next generation of women. The second thing we are doing is we are working with the ministerial teams, and we are working at the moment with the DHSC and NHS England to pave the path for a national strategy and the right funding and resources to make sure that there is surveillance, there is the foundations for a training program, which will mean that people are more informed and are able to diagnose this earlier. And the third part is we've actually submitted to the HSSIB, which is, for those that don't know that are listening, it's the Health Safety Investigation Branch, thanks to the support of Sir Jeremy Hunt and James Titcombe, who's been a fantastic advocate. We are asking for an independent audit. We're asking for us to look, because of the work we are doing right now to investigate more trusts. We know that this is happening in different places, but we want them to investigate the problem, to say that, you know, this is a problem. This is getting worse with more C-sections, IVF. PPH is at 19%, which is the highest rate of postpartum hemorrhage. It is part of the maternity care bundle as number 5 for obstetric hemorrhage, is one of the specific goals of the government. We need to know that this is happening and how we can solve for that. And we believe very clearly that if that audit happens, we want an implementation framework. So we have submitted to the Baroness Amos report. We would be highly disappointed if Placenta Accreta is not mentioned at all in that report. We have been in constant touch with the National Maternity Investigation Team. But even if that doesn't happen, we're not stopping. We have built this campaign for the next mother and baby, and it's because, and I'd say this at the end, Heidi, if it wasn't for you educating us in November, December, January around intergrowth restrictions, all the incredible work that you and the couple that you worked with and Tommy's and Sands and others have done to save other babies, we wouldn't have realized it was possible, because you proved to us one thing, that, you know what, one person can make a difference. You know, a small stone in an ocean doesn't look like it's making a difference. But it does. And, you know, small steps, incremental growth, and working together as one community and village, it only happens when you do it together. And it only happens when you want constructive change, and it has to be at the systemic level. So had it have not been for Mama Academy, I don't think we would have got to where we were today, because I think it gave us the tools and the inspiration. And also it gave us the confidence that guidelines in things in trust, things can change. And yes, it is one of the things that takes a long time, but women can't wait.
No.
People can't wait for this to happen. And I can't wait for a report of reports to tell me that there's 748 recommendations. And that's the nice thing about Placenta Accreta. It's discrete, it's achievable, it's measurable. It's something that's going to impact the next decade of women. I think the fact that it was 1 in 2,500 in 2015 when Kim Kardashian gave birth, and now it's 1 in 272, you will in 100% in 10 years time be hearing this. Check your placenta. I mean, I'm calling it on Mama Academy's podcast first. Hashtag check your placenta is going to be a thing, like the sepsis was in its own campaign. So check your placenta is going to be a big thing. And I think we're just grateful that you believed us, Heidi. I think you believed us, you supported us, you gave us the tools, and that's the reason we are where we are today. And we're just hoping that people listen to this and continue supporting you, being the trust that they do. And it was that little pouch that made all the difference, because it was that pouch we picked up in our bedroom, and I said to Amisha, we need to contact this person, because they were a big part of our care journey.
Well, I'm so pleased you did, because it's been such a privilege to support you and walk alongside you with this. I find you guys so inspiring to me for all that you've done, and we will continue supporting you all the way. And I'd just like to encourage all the listeners to go onto your website, to look you up on socials, follow you, and to really dig deep into your website, learn everything there is to learn on there. And let's all get on board with your campaign to prevent it happening to other families. So thank you so much for everything you're doing. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all on the podcast today. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amisha.
All right. Bye.
Fletcher Solicitors are proud to support the Mama Academy by sponsoring this podcast series. At Fletcher Solicitors, we champion better maternity care. For every birth, for every baby, for every family.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, share it with a friend or colleague. Make sure you follow us so you don't miss out on our next episode. If you'd like to support our work by fundraising or volunteering, please email contact@mamaacademy.org.uk. For more information on pregnancy and maternity services, please visit our website at www.mamaacademy.org.uk. We're also on all of your favourite social media channels. See you next time!